What is your darkest family secret? My grandfather was killed in a bar when my father was still a toddler. The official story was that he was murdered over a pinball game. Back then pinball was pretty serious, I guess. It wasn't until recently my grandmother confessed, on her deathbed, that my grandfather actually killed someone and buried the body, days before his own demise. So he was actually killed in retaliation for a murder that he committed. My grandmother kept this secret for almost 65 years. When my mother was still young, my grandfather found out she had a boyfriend. He shot her BF dead and then they killed my grandfather because of it. A year or two after her adoptive mother died, my mom went looking for information about her birth parents and found that her birth mom and her husband had been gruesomely murdered by a drug cartel. There was an article about their murder in Rolling Stone magazine that had gory pictures of their bodies. Must have been really shocking to her. Hope she's well now. A male blood relative went to prison for drug dealing and major theft. Whilst in prison he was diagnosed with Hep C, likely from sharing needles. When he got out of prison, he raped his 13-year-old stepdaughter. There's a high likelihood that he raped his other daughters. One died from a drug overdose and the other committed suicide. He died in prison from Hep C complications and liver cancer. A not too distant cousin fricked over his notoriously dangerous bikie gang in a big way, including forcing himself on someone's wife and stealing a high-ups motorbike, and has been on the run for the last 20 years. It's me. My dad never told his family I existed. I was shameful. Maybe he was more ashamed. After he died they found out about me and kindly asked me not to come to the funeral. I get why he never told them. As part of opening a home daycare, Mom found somebody on the sex offender registry with our family's very unusual last name. Mom called Grandpa. He confirmed that he is related to us. He hadn't seen him in decades. He didn't know he had been convicted for statutory but thought that sounded about right. We're not supposed to ask about him again. Good for your grandpa keeping dangerous people away from his family even if they are related to him. That's the right thing to do and too many stories on here are unfortunately because people did the opposite. My dad gave a job to a cousin. I remember as a kid that this cousin I'd never heard of just suddenly popped up out of nowhere without explanation, but I was a kid so didn't really think of it, but everyone made a big deal out of how great it was for my dad to give him a job. I found out 20 years later that the cousin had been in prison for having a sexual relationship with a student. My friend was a superintendent and a teacher in the 80s. It was the norm. Still was through the 90s. He said he remembers teachers popping a dare or two to get through school. Kids were preyed on so much then. My cousin, once removed, my parents' cousin, was kidnapped, raped and tortured by a serial killer. She was, after many days, dropped off near a running path with her neck slit. She lived, unlike the other three, and she could lead the police to his home. He is still in prison. As a child I heard whispering of it and didn't find out the whole truth until I was older. My great uncle was born from his sister being raped by her father. The family said basically she had just been a loose lady and not right in the head. They locked her up in the attic. After my great uncle passed, my mother and I went into the multi-generation house to clean it out. The door to the attic, where sister mom was kept but long since passed. The door had an outside lock. No creepy claw marks or anything. But it was just so sad. My mom pulled the lock off and announced to the house that she would never be shut away again. Thank you to your mom for doing that. My cousin might actually be my uncle. His mom boinked my grandfather not long before she discovered her pregnancy. There hasn't been a paternity test, but my cousin learned about it and it fricked him up. I found out 6 months before my dad died that he was a H addict earlier in his life. He was dying of liver disease and tried to overdose one night. I didn't live with him at the time but knew something was wrong, and that's when my mom and I went and found him on the floor of his bathroom with a needle in his arm. My dad, before he met my mom, was a H addict and got clean. Years later he was diagnosed with Hep C, which developed into liver cancer. He commented that if he could he would just OD so he could just go to sleep and not wake up. I wouldn't take it as a relapse, just a way to end the pain. One family member killed another by leaving a bag of poisoned donuts on the front steps. We are now hesitant about accepting donuts. I had an uncle who moved far away, worked in a boiler room at a huge casino. Decades ago. He was always sketchy, and he had way more money than a simple boiler room employee ought to have had. Rumors that the boiler room was a really useful thing for the mob, due to boilers doubling as incinerators for certain purposes. Hence the money. Many unanswered questions there. Guess it's kinda obvious that your uncle got paid to look the other way while the mob used the boiler room to cook their pizzas. My great-grandfather shot and killed a man in his grocery store back in the 30s over a poker game. He ran a speakeasy out of the back of his store and lost almost $2k, so as the guy was walking out the front after the store closed, he shot him and got away with it by telling the police the man robbed him. It wasn't until he was on his deathbed he told my grandfather what had happened. In the film Driving Miss Daisy, when the chauffeur, played by Morgan Freeman, is driving Miss Daisy to worship service, they get stuck in a traffic jam. He gets out to see what the holdup is. When he gets back in, he says, "You won't be going to service today. Somebody done bombed the temple, Hebrew Benevolent Congregation Temple, Atlanta, 1958. She says, "What? Who would do such a thing?" "My uncle. That's who." I learned my disabled great aunt was raped multiple times while she was in high school, including by a teacher, and it resulted in at least 3 pregnancies that she was forced to carry and give up for adoption, and then shamed for. I found out because I did 23andMe found cousins my dad couldn't explain, so there was a very awful phone call to understand why disabled women are at the highest risk for sexual assault. I am so sorry. Had an uncle that was a sharpshooter in the US Navy, and there's a famous movie about a mission he was on. He was also bat crap crazy and beat his kids and was a serious hoarder. This whole thread has me wondering if becoming an uncle instantly turns you into an insane person. My brother shot himself in the leg to get out of Iraq and tried to blame it on an enemy attack. I learned about this the day I arrived in Afghanistan for my year-long tour. All I heard was that he was shot. I found out later it was a self-inflicted wound and he was out on suicide watch and was kicked out with a less than honorable discharge. He's never actually told anyone this. I just heard it through the National Guard being kind of like a gossipy small town. I actually don't hold it against him. War sucked. He's absolutely ruined his life since then by becoming an alcoholic and sitting the world out. Just sad all around. Also, my mom and her sister married the same man, so all my siblings are also cousins with each other. Buried the lead, lol. Found out last year that I am a direct descendant of Thomas Rood. He was the first person to be executed for incest in the US. He raped his daughter Sarah and it came to light when she gave birth to a son named George. My family line is descended from George. My dad's biological father was a Rood. I know almost nothing about that branch of my family tree, but we could be distant relatives. My grandpa was kidnapped and forced to work for the Viet Cong. When he died in combat, no one on either side would claim him, so he was buried in an unmarked grave. My grandma was left caring for 3 kids, my mom, aunt, uncle. Grandma was working in the fields until someone got her to work as a bar girl in Saigon. She met my now step-grandfather, American GI, and they got married and she moved to Ohio with him. She never told him she had any kids BC she didn't think he would marry her. When my mom came to America 2 decades later, my grandma made her say my mom was her niece. I still call him uncle. My great uncle molested my mom for many years around age 3 or 4 till her teens, as well as molesting or exposing himself to her 3 sisters. He also molested at least 2 of his sons and other children from his church. Not much of a secret, I guess, since he confessed, got a pathetic sentence of house arrest, and my stupid great aunt is still with him. Ugh. My great grandmother, single, came over from Germany after World War I and had a kid 2 months later. She met a guy and worked for him for about a decade, mysteriously having 2 more kids during that time. Eventually she got married and moved away, and left the kids with the man. She eventually had my great grandfather, and he grew up without knowing anything about his half siblings. That was until about 70 years later when one of their daughters sent a letter to my grandma explaining their relationship. They promptly met up and realized they had only been living about 20 miles from each other, and the relationship rekindled from there. They even came to my grandpa's funeral in '99. where it was revealed that some of the family actually did know about them all along. When people asked how they were related, the older family members would refuse to elaborate and would brush them off. My father, however, would make sure to tell the story to everyone who asked, and made sure these older family members could hear it all. My family is of Swiss descent. My great-grandfather murdered someone back in Switzerland, then fled to the US with his wife. They moved to a small town in Virginia and had my grandpa along with his siblings. Grandpa only found out about this because he found multiple journals depicting the turmoil it caused between him and his wife while fleeing to the US. I once borrowed my granddad's video camera for a trip. He said he put a fresh tape in the camera for me and gave me a backup. I was like 12 at the time and into filming stuff. I wanted to be a director. Get back from the trip, rewind the tape and review the footage. Low light in a room I didn't recognize. 2 people, one laying down, another to the side, bobbing her. Oh my god, my grandparents made a porno and granny was blowing pepper. I told my dad what I saw. We never spoke of it and they have no idea I know. Papa took that secret to the grave with him 3 years ago, and I got freaking decades to live with that scar now. I'm really sorry that you had to see your grandparents in this state, but it's kind of wholesome compared to the other stuff on this thread. There was, I assume, consent between a married couple, but for you, yeah, that sucks. My grandma tried to kill my grandpa. My dad tells me that my grandpa was a controlling, emotionally abusive person and never let my grandma go out, even to church. But my dad also doesn't reveal much about the past. All I know is that there's a lot of resentment. Towards the end of his life, my grandpa had a stroke and was completely bedridden and couldn't speak. He was coherent and understood when we spoke to him. We had a full-time carer for him who would bathe him, feed him, etc. because my grandma didn't want to. As it turns out, she was not giving him or the carer any food. Later we also found out that she wasn't giving him his medicines and would ignore him for hours when he had fits. She would not give him the adult diapers and let him lay in his filth for days. Eventually, my uncle took him in and they took over his care. Even though my aunt was recovering from breast cancer, he was doing well and recovered somewhat. My grandma sometimes visited him and asked to be left alone. Once the carer caught her trying to strangle him, and she threatened to call the cops. She just stayed quiet while my uncle kicked her out. This worsened his condition, and he was in the ICU for a while. At some point when she visited him, my grandma had also broken his arm. We didn't know because he couldn't verbalize it. All that pain and resentment, I could see that happening. Abuse for so many years is heck. My dad died of a drug overdose when he was only 25. I was 6 months old. Our family and his hid the true reason and told everyone it was a heart attack. This is even what I grew up thinking. Only my mom, my aunt, 2 uncles, and my 4 grandparents knew the real cause. I found out the real cause of his death when I had to get his death certificate for college financial aid, and now I am burdened with continuing the lie to the greater community who knew him. Oh, that's a very awkward way to find out. Awkward too for all the people who tried to hide it from you. My great-great-grandmother had a black father and was considered really taboo in the 1860s. My great-grandmother is 98 years old and was telling us about a guy who was black and absolutely adored her in the 1920s and early 30s and would come over to play with her, but the family had to keep it a secret as he was black and she was white. Story goes that her grandmother married her grandfather. My great-grandmother's mom had to pretend that he worked as the help on the farm in South Dakota when he was really his father. She told us about it when my grandfather did a DNA test and it came back that he was part black and had black family members. We only found out last year. I'll see you at cookout. My aunt was molested as a child by my great uncle who I never met, for obvious reasons. She didn't tell anyone until she was in her 30s, though by then everyone knew he was a piece of crap for other reasons, so he was already excommunicated from the family. I was molested by my cousin when I was 9. Totally different ballgame. Everyone swept it under the rug, didn't want to address it. Some of my own family didn't even believe me, but she did. She believed me and defended me no matter what came her way. She died a few years back. I don't know if I ever explicitly thanked her for doing that for me, but I think she knew how much I loved her for it. My mom walked in on my uncle servicing the best man the night before he married my aunt. This was the mid 1960s. So being bi or gay wasn't something many people admitted to. She said nothing to anyone, only told my dad years later. Dad's cousin was a prominent Catholic priest known for his staunchly anti-LGBT views. Well, it was quite the surprise when he was arrested trying to solicit a BJ from an undercover cop at a gay bookstore in New Orleans. It's New Orleans. You can't really say you've really visited the French Quarter if you haven't had Café au lait and Big Nuts at Café du Monde, caught a jazz set at Preservation Hall, and gotten your knob slobbed in a bookstore. Multiple parts. 1. My great-grandfather was the illegitimate child of an Italian doctor and was born somewhere in southern Italy. Supposedly the doctor had an affair, and to cover it up he sent my great-grandfather to northern Italy as an infant where he became an orphan. 2. As an adult my great-grandfather immigrates to the US where he had multiple children, mostly women, who I've been told he sexually abused for the majority of their childhoods. This was not spoken about until the last of his children were on their deathbeds. 3. My great-grandfather's eldest daughter has a child about my mother's age, her cousin, who she grew up with. The father of the child is forever kept a secret and never spoken about, but I personally believe that my mother's cousin may be the child of my great-grandfather. 4. My great-grandfather supposedly got involved with the Italian mafia at some point, robs a bank with 2 other family members, my young grandmother supposedly the getaway driver, and eventually gets caught and all go to prison for a time. With the exception of my grandmother, all are released from prison and all die of natural causes, supposedly. I just found all of this out about 2 years ago. I'm 33 years old. I cringe. My cousin sexually abused me when I was 7. He was 17, and it messed me up, and now I have to pretend I'm happy he's getting the organ transplant he needs. I hope he freaking dies. I was sexually abused by my brother with a similar age difference. It has also fricked me up a lot. I never told anyone in my family, and now that it's been over 20 years it feels weird at this point. You're not alone, and for what it's worth I hope your cousin's body rejects a new organ. My sister was given a horse for her birthday when she was young, but shortly after we moved houses. During the move, we left the horse with our granddad till we had our own pasture fenced up. My granddad was a pleasant enough man, but he was a mean drunk. One day the horse jumped his fence while he was day drinking. He took his truck out, and instead of walking in back, he tied it to the back of his truck and took the scenic route back home. By the time he got back the horse's legs and sides had been skinned to heck and had to be put down afterwards. We stopped relations with him for a long while until he got cancer. I learned this after his funeral. That's just evil. B rank. Learning that my great-grandfather had sexually abused at least one of his daughters, my great-aunts, particularly the youngest. His abuse of the youngest resulted in him getting jail time. It was the only time he was punished. This was in the mid-50s. I rank. Learning that one of these molestations resulted in a pregnancy for the second eldest, which was given up through a closed adoption. This was around 1949. S rank. Learning that the eldest actually took her father to bed and wanted to be his wife. She saw herself, not her mother, as his real and natural wife for the rest of his life. This was from the late 1940s through his death in 1986. Whether or not a conjugal relationship continued is unknown, but maybe that will be the next thing I learn. My grandparents made a wonderful life for themselves and their children. Those children and their children, my generation, had a great life. Learning about what happened before that was so shocking I can't put it in words. You know it's gonna be rough when the beat here is already sexual abuse. Oof. When I was little I found out my mother was hated by her entire family due to she having a different mother than all her siblings, and I only know this because I was hated due to me having a different father than all of my siblings. So my grandmother told me, her biological mom, it feels strange having so much family but have nobody even want to associate with you. My mom left me at 15 months old with my teenage father. Neither wanted me, but when my dad married my stepmom, she really hated me and the mother I never knew and told me all the time, I understand how you feel. I am actually the dark family secret. All of my brothers and sister know, but they don't know that I know. They've kept the secret from everyone except one person. And that person told me. My mother had a secret affair that resulted in pregnancy and my father raised me like I was his own. I sometimes contemplate about whether to tell my sons, but probably won't. I actually recalled having met the other father when I was really young but not since and not interested in meeting him now. Both of my parents have passed so I'm not going to make any issues out of it. My grandmother was married 3 times, not twice like I'd been told. Apparently her first marriage was to a gay man and quickly dissolved. This was presented to me as a big family secret, but I like cool, I'm 12. But I did end up digging up their marriage certificate on Ancestry in college. My mom was sexually abused for years by her uncle with polio. Her family was poor so she slept on the couch and my grandma knew it was happening yet didn't do anything. I found out from my dad in my mid-teens and it's changed the way I view everything. All of a sudden I became resentful of my loving grandparents and family for not protecting my mom. It shook me to the core that I could be so oblivious of my mom's trauma. I knew she had a rough childhood but it was worse than I thought. My grandfather, uncles, brother and cousins have no idea. I wasn't going to answer this but here I go. There was a man who was my grandmother's brother. My sister and I referred to him as Uncle Jay. Well, Uncle Jay was a weird dude, but then again my family on that side always seemed a bit out there. I found out many years later after he died of cancer that he was a rapist and no one in the family wanted to acknowledge it. He raped my mother and some of her cousins. Now we spent some holidays in the house that he lived in and he was always drunk, but I'm honestly freaking irate that my mother didn't keep us away from someone like him. Had he still been alive about 10 years ago I would probably have killed him myself once I found out what he did. Long story short, if you are the parent of young children and you don't keep them away from predators, you are failing your children. Protecting a rapist solely on the basis of family is freaking disgusting. Dang, there are really some dark stories in here. Some stuff on my dad's side of the family. 1. We live in a country, Singapore, where Chinese is a majority race and my family has always been listed as racially Chinese in our documents. Photos of my grandparents show that my grandfather was significant darker skinned though, and we have 2 photos of my great grandmother in Burmese wear. Turns out that my great grandmother knew that things would be better for us if people thought we were Chinese, so she got a Chinese man to adopt my grandfather in name. In my country our race as stated in documents follows our paternal lineage. I'm a quarter Burmese, my dad is half, and he gets upset when we mention he's not fully Chinese. 2. My dad had a sister who died very young and that was the extent of what he would tell me when I was growing up. I decided to pry again just recently and found out that my aunt was a drug addict who married a British man, had a son, a subsequent divorce and then ran away to England to marry another British man who claimed he was a jewel tycoon. None of the men she married cared enough about her to even remember what kind of Asian she was or where she was from. We strongly suspect the second husband bought her or had some other similar arrangement. She then died from an immune disorder and had her funeral back home in Singapore. Her second husband didn't pay for anything. He didn't even want to buy the shoes for her to wear in her coffin. And no one knows anything about him or his family. I found her son, my long lost cousin, and he said his dad, the first husband, told everyone we were Cambodian. My cousin lives in Australia now and he had a lot of questions for me, including why no one ever visited him. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.